In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at a classic example of Magnus Carlsen, for lack of a better phrase, taking a big steaming dump all over the most cherished chess principles upon which the very pillars of opening theory have been painstakingly erected by the greatest minds of the past 200 years. Is this an abominable desecration of traditional chess family values? Or is it a refreshing and innovative departure from the old tired paradigm that says, control the center, get your pieces out, and don't move the same 3 pawns for your first 5 moves of the game, as Magnus Carlsen does in the bizarre opening that you are about to witness? However you feel about Magnus's behavior in this game, it is pretty hard to argue with his results, since despite his ludicrous opening decisions, Magnus is somehow able to achieve an absolutely crushing position after only making 10 moves. And this isn't against some random master. Magnus is up against none other than the Super GM Geoffrey Chong, who at his peak was ranked number 30 in the world, and who at the time of this Blitz encounter, played back in 2023, had an online rating of 2981. So a formidable opponent to be sure, and one that you would think would be more than capable of brutally punishing anyone who tried pulling a stunt like the one Magnus does in this game. But Magnus Carlsen seems to have a strange power over even the world's most elite players. I don't know exactly what kind of sorcery he's into, but we're going to do our best to try to figure it out so we can practice it as well. So let's get right into this amazing game. Magnus Carlsen has Team White, and he opens this shenanigan-ridden encounter with e4. Best by test, so they say, to which Geoffrey responds c5, the Sicilian defense. An opening long known to be one of the best ways to play for a win with the black pieces, breaking the symmetry of the position right off the bat, which can lead to a high degree of imbalance and complexity in the middle game. A bold decision to be sure, and one that does not go unrewarded by the ever-gracious Magnus Carlsen, who in his live stream remarked that his opponent, for his bravery, deserves to be hit with a3. A move which, according to the engine, is just barely better than making no move at all. This is known as the Mongarini variation, and there's a good chance that I'm mispronouncing it, but I don't really care because it's not really a serious opening. It doesn't control the center, it doesn't develop a piece, and it doesn't not move any more pawns than are absolutely necessary in order to control the center and or develop one's pieces. Its only pathetic excuse for a redeeming quality is the fact that it does support the move b4, with which white will sometimes gambit a pawn. But even this is apparently a bit too mainstream for Magnus, who after g6, a good sensible move, preparing to fianchetto the bishop, decides to push another pawn with h4. A move clearly inspired by the legendary computer program AlphaZero, who taught humanity just how good it can be to push that h-pawn early and often, and all the way to h6 if at all possible, but playing h4 this soon is going a bit overboard. Even AlphaZero would typically get in a few more traditional looking moves first, like knight to f3, knight to c3, or bishop to c4, all of which are superior to h4 here. Not that Magnus wasn't fully aware of this. He did remark as he played the move h4 that this is a case of don't try this at home. Although what he really meant to say is don't try this if you're not me. Now a good response for black here would be knight to c6. When an immediate h5 could be met with knight to f6, attacking both e4 and h5, thus rendering the move h6 unplayable unless white wants to drop his e-pawn, and so pretty much compelling him to take on g6, which of course is not exactly the AlphaZero way, since the ultimate goal should be to establish that thorn pawn in black's kingside on h6. But this is not what happened in the game, where after h4 from Magnus, we have d5. Which isn't too bad, but it does give Magnus a chance to now play a fascinating gambit with the move h5, which, believe it or not, unlike Magnus's first 3 moves, is actually one of the engine's top choices. The point is, if Geoffrey were to now play d takes e4, which he does not, then after h takes g6, forcing black to recapture with his f-pawn, due to the pin on his h-pawn, black has a pretty terrible central pawn structure. He's also lost control of the c4 square, where white can potentially put his bishop, targeting this weak diagonal. So for these reasons, Geoffrey does not capture on e4, but rather plays bishop to g7, which is just fine and dandy. Magnus now decides to take on d5. Since after queen takes d5, he does get to play knight to c3 with an attack on the queen, which Geoffrey should really now move to e6 with check. Looks a little weird, I know, blocking the e-pawn as well as the light squared bishop, but it will prevent Magnus from getting his bishop to c4 anytime soon, which, as we're going to see, is a very nice square. And black can always play b6 and then bishop to b7 with some nice pressure on white's king side. So this is the engine's vision for Team Black. In the game, however, Jeffrey moves his queen back to d8, which is a very Scandinavian type of thing to do, but Magnus, being the strongest Scandinavian in the history of the game, knows exactly how to punish such a timid retreat, and that is with white's strongest move in the position, bishop to c4, which actually begins to tip the scale in white's favor. After knight to c6, which is as good a move as any, and d3 from Magnus, the move h6 is now on the cards, as it's now supported by both bishop and rook. So how to deal with that as black? You don't really want to capture on h5 and allow queen takes h5, targeting f7. Knight to h6, blocking the pawn seems to be playable, and it just might be best, but what's played is knight to d4, just allowing h6, which at this point, according to the almighty engine, in whom we of course place our unshakable faith and trust, is giving white a totally winning position. And we could go down the rabbit hole of trying to prove exactly why, but I think most of you will probably be satisfied with the overgeneralization that computers just love pawns on h6, and that's all we really need to know. Magnus does not play h6, however, but rather knight to f3, which would be very strong as well, and maybe even winning if not for the move bishop to g4, which unfortunately for Jeffrey, he does not play. Now Magnus did anticipate this move though, and in his live stream he mentioned the following variation. Bishop takes f7 check, king takes f7, knight to g5 check, king to e8, and queen takes bishop on g4, getting the piece back. Now black has knight takes c2 check, forking king and rook, a move which, had I been able to calculate this far, would likely have caused me to reject this entire variation. However, after king to e2, which was as far as Magnus calculated, at least verbally anyway, his conclusion was, and I quote, "Looks interesting, at the very least probably good for me," unquote. And this is why I'll never be like Magnus Carlsen. Okay, there's a lot more reasons than that, but this seems to be a perfect example of his near God-level intuition coming into play. He just knows things, and without much apparent effort, and he's usually right. Now black is actually okay here if he moves his knight back to d4 with check, but he better not grab the rook on a1, because after knight to e6 attacking the queen, black is totally hosed, and not in the good way. The engine is giving queen to b6, knight takes g7 check, king to f7, and h6 with a huge winning advantage for white, despite the fact that he is down the exchange. Okay, the black king's position is looking pretty drafty, but the fact that it's basically game over for Team Black here is something that I would definitely have to put some work into to try and prove, as opposed to Magnus, who apparently can just feel it. It really is incredible just how easy this all seems to be for him. Let's return to the game though, where after knight to f3, Jeffrey rejects bishop to g4, which was his best move, in favor of the extremely blunderous g takes h5, allowing Magnus to now play knight takes d4, and after c takes d4, we have a very nice little intermezzo, queen takes h5, targeting f7, a move that we earlier concluded would not be good for black to allow, but it has been allowed, and Jeffrey is now in big trouble. Pawn takes knight on c3 is an absolute no-go, since after queen takes f7 check and king to d7, white could just pick up the bishop on g7, although something like bishop to b5 check, king to c7, and bishop to f4 check is even more devastating. So I think we've seen quite enough of this. We all know how this story is going to end. What's played in the game, in response to queen takes h5, is the much more sensible e6, blocking the bishop's diagonal. But at this point, Magnus, as he's known to do, has switched from dubious opening mode to flawless engine mode, as he now continues with the top move, knight to e4, getting the knight out of danger while putting it on a beautiful central square. And this brings us to an interesting moment, where Magnus actually predicts the next 3 moves of the game, 3 of his opponent's moves and 3 of his moves, for a total of 6 ply. So feel free to pause the video if you want to try and guess what variation Magnus is envisioning here. It begins with knight to f6, now played by Jeffrey, to which Magnus replies queen to g5. Rook to g8 defends the bishop, and now we have bishop to b5 check. Black doesn't have a lot of options here, Blocking with the knight is out of the question, as it allows checkmate in 2 with knight to d6 check, followed by queen takes d8. Black's best try is the obvious bishop to d7. Now, did Jeffrey reject this because it allows the knight to come into d6 with check? I would say probably, and this is totally winning for white. Black's now never going to be able to castle. The engine is giving king to f8, followed by knight takes b7. The nuts and bolts of which we're not going to delve into, other than to say this is probably the most desirable of all Black's totally hopeless options, since at least here his queen is defended by the rook. Why is that relevant? Well, if you don't know, you're about to find out. In the game, after bishop to b5 check from Magnus, Jeffrey plays king to f8, allowing a very nice tactic which Magnus spotted 3 moves earlier. Feel free to pause and have yourself a gander if you'd like to try to be just like Magnus Carlsen. Magnus's move, while not necessarily the strongest in the position, though probably the most forcing, is rook takes h7, taking advantage of the fact that the knight on f6 is pinned to the queen and therefore not free to recapture on h7. Now there is an important move here for Black that I would be severely remiss not to mention, and one that Magnus did mention himself, and that move is queen to a5 check, unpinning the knight on f6 so that after bishop to d2, Black can now play knight takes h7 with a counterattack on White's queen without losing his queen to queen takes d8. However, White has something much worse in this position, which many of you have probably already spotted, and that is queen to c5 checkmate. So getting back to the game, where after rook takes h7, queen to a5 check is not working, meaning that Magnus has won himself a clean pawn. But what he's now threatening is vastly worse than that. Magnus actually has multiple crushing threats here, which Black doesn't really have a good way to answer. What's tried is queen to e7, giving the queen some defense, meaning that knight takes h7 is now a threat, but this now gives Magnus 2 different ways he can cash in and win some material. Both equally devastating, although the move that Magnus does not play is just a bit more decisive. See if you can spot it. What is White's best move in this position? The strongest move is knight takes f6, and this is a very pretty little line. Now, if queen takes f6, then we have rook takes g7, when rook takes rook would lose the queen. You can't take with the king. After queen takes queen and rook takes queen, White is just up a piece, and if queen takes rook on g7, then White has queen to d8 checkmate. How beautiful is that? Okay, let's look at one more option, which after knight takes f6 is bishop takes f6. Here we have a mate in 4 with queen to h6 check, bishop to g7, queen takes g7 check, rook takes g7, rook to h8 check, rook to g8, and bishop to h6 checkmate, when king to e8 is of course impossible because of the bishop on b5. So that would have been quite a stunning finish. In the game, Magnus goes for the much simpler and also winning rook takes g7, removing a defender from the knight on f6 so that after rook takes g7 he's got queen takes f6, winning the 2 minor pieces for his rook. Now this does allow a queen trade with queen takes f6, and after knight takes f6, Jeffrey is able to grab a pawn on g2, but after king to f1 attacking the rook and rook to g6 attacking the knight, despite the simplification and the pawn grab on g2, Black is still without a prayer. Magnus could just play knight to e4 here, then maybe bishop to g5 or bishop to d2, headed to b4, king to e2, then he can activate his rook. Things are just way too harmonious for White here, while Black's pieces are kind of discombobulated, but Magnus now finds a nice alternative to retreating his knight, and that is bishop to g5, defending the knight. This does not lose a piece to rook takes bishop due to knight to h7 forking king and rook. So what's played instead is king to e7, an interesting decision to be sure, putting the king right in the bishop's line of fire, to which White could respond knight to e4, discovered check, defending the bishop, but Magnus goes for f4, allowing Jeffrey to capture on f6, when if Magnus were to immediately recapture with bishop takes f6, then he would lose his entire winning advantage to king takes bishop, equalizing the material count and the game. But Magnus knows that that rook on f6 isn't going anywhere as it's pinned to the king, and so he instead opts for the much better and winning king to e2, preparing rook to h1 and then rook to h6, which will pick up the rook on f6 for free. And there's really not a lot Black can do about this, since there's no good way to alleviate the pin on the rook. e5 planning king to e6 doesn't work since f takes e5 would hit that pinned rook with the pawn. So what's played is a6, counterattacking the bishop. It goes to a4, and now b5, counterattacking again. And how many of us would just auto-respond with bishop to b3 here, especially in a blitz game? I think more than a few of us, but this would actually throw away the win, since after bishop to b7, there is no rook to h1. That square is now covered. So how is that rook getting to h6? It's not. Not soon enough to win that rook on f6 anyway. This is why, in the game, Magnus responds to b5 with the correct move, rook to h1. Jeffrey does get to grab the bishop on a4, but now Magnus has his rook to h6. And after bishop to b7, he's able to take the rook with check. Now after king to d6, Magnus has correctly foreseen that he's going to get some material. He could immediately take the pawn on d4, but he decides to throw in rook to h7 first, attacking f7. Jeffrey goes for some counterplay now with rook to g8, looking to come into g2, but after bishop takes d4, rook to g2 check, and the bishop blocks. Magnus is a healthy pawn up, he's still hitting f7, while black has a terrible pawn structure on the queen side. Jeffrey defends his pawn with king to e7, but here comes the passer to c4, which Jeffrey now gets in front of with bishop to c6. Magnus gets his king moving towards the center now with king to e3. We have a rook to g8, probably headed towards the queen side, but now we have a very well-timed bishop to h4 check, forcing black's king to the back rank if he wants to keep defending f7. Magnus slides his bishop into f6, a very oppressive square, hence the move rook to g6, attacking it. The bishop goes to e5. f6 hits the bishop again. We have bishop to d6, now threatening rook to e7 check, followed by rook takes e6. Jeffrey lashes out with a check. Magnus plays king to d4, totally unfazed, still threatening rook to e7 check. Black could now defend his e-pawn with bishop to d7, but then white has rook to h8 check, followed by rook to a8, going after those weak pawns on the a file, among many other winning options. What's played is rook to g6, and after rook to e7 check, king to d8, and rook takes e6, we have king to d7, which almost looks like it wins a piece, since it attacks both bishop and rook, until you realize that white has f5, keeping everything defended. Although, fun fact, even king to c5 would have been winning after king takes rook and king takes bishop, which I'll let you verify on your own if you'd like. But next we have rook to g4 check, and after king to c5, Jeffrey Shong resigns the game, seeing that Magnus is threatening both rook takes pawn on f6 and rook to e7 check, winning the bishop on c6. So nothing to be done here. Black's dropping at least another pawn, giving him a 3-pawn deficit and no hope of survival. So what did you think? How does one best explain Magnus defeating elite players like Jeffrey Shong with such reckless opening play? I've made it pretty clear what I think is going on, and I'm going to try to get involved in it. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but it will become pretty obvious once I do. Anyway, thank you for watching. Don't try this at home. Don't practice sorcery, but do subscribe to the channel and hit that like button if there's anything you liked about this video or anything else. Leave a comment with literally anything that's on your mind, and I will see you next time.